Chapter 7. In spite of LeBron's anxious urgency, it was 4 clear days before the chariot wheels and the hoofbeats thundered in the silent dawn as Kion led his army of vengeance from the hill of Tara. 4 days allowed him to summon his men to meet him on his journey of war, and warriors from the fields and hills and the rolling fertile plains of Meath itself, who stood in the king's service but did not dwell in the great barrack halls of Tara, but in their own homesteads with their families, tilling their fields and tending their cattle until such moments as this, when Kion sent forth the call to arms, and they gathered under his banner to avenge their king. LeBron went with them, and Cessnan, who seemed during these 4 days of waiting to have fallen into the grip of age, as he watched the preparations for destruction and death to be loosed on so many hapless people by his carelessness. "Can you not simply kill me, who am responsible," he pleaded to LeBron, "and leave alone those who are guilty of no fault?" He was thinking of the done in Daichu, crammed with the innocent who did no more than follow Patrick, many of them his own people, who had gone at the same time as Macha. Kill only me, he begged. "I alone am at fault." LeBron looked at him sideways, pity and mild contempt in his glance. "It is not too much to say now, my poor cousin," he said dryly, that it no longer concerns you at all. You are but one of Fergus's pawns on the chessboard of the king." Cessnan was not as simple as he thought him. He nodded sadly, and his eyes were on the warriors tramping in steadily along the 5 roads, gathering to Kion's bidding in their saffron tunics, with their handstones resting in the hollows of their dark blue shields, and the points of their spears tipped for terror with the blood of adders. Cessnan looked at them and shook his sad head. "I know," he said. "I know it is no longer me, but does it take all these to kill one man?" Some of them were chiefs, not long ridden away from the festival, and LeBron knew them as they rode back. Loskin of the crooked teeth, he must have nearly 100 men. Tina of long arms, 30, you say? Kilton of the hill, Kethin of the bright face, 40 men. They all looked cheerful and gay, laughing as they rode and marched. They were looking forward to the battle. They knew of Daichu and his strength, and the fighting should be good. Life had been too peaceful of late. "All these," said Cessnan, again heavily, watching the bright gathering of the warriors, "all these to kill one man, and I tell you, Patrick will not defend himself. One of these would do, just so long as he has a sword." He could not believe that this monstrous situation had grown out of that spellbound evening in his hall. "He himself may not resist," answered LeBron, "but the man Daichu has given him shelter, and therefore must be destroyed also, and his done above his head, and from what I have heard of Daichu, he will resist. He will not wait and take his death in quietness from the avenger." Cessnan took his eyes from the figures plodding up the green slopes of the hill, and from the golden stretch of the sunlit fields beyond them in the fair country of Meath, and laid his despairing head down into his hands. He remembered the evening 2 days ago now, when they had left the High King, and LeBron had led him through the soft spring darkness of the sputtering torchlight, down the long eastern slope of the Hill of the Wraths of Warriors, and the road that led out toward the fields and dwelling of the soldiers who lived always in the king's service. At the painted door of the dwelling of the king's chamber, LeBron was hidden was bidden a warm welcome. He had been there frequently of late, arranging matters of Keon's coming marriage to his daughter, and the young man stood up from the couch behind his table and came to greet him barefoot, with outstretched, welcoming hands, bidding him to be seated beside him, calling up his servants to bring more wine. Keon of Crimson Cup, they called him, as well as his more warlike name, for his well-known love of the sharp, dark red wine of Gaul, tart and bitter, to many of the sweet-tongued Irish. "Keep your wine, Keon, my friend." LeBron lifted a forbidding hand. "We are on King's business." Keon's gaze sharpened and swept over the two men, and beside LeBron, Seston stared sadly at the tall young warrior, and could have wept then and there for his beloved little Macha, that he had so unwittingly destroyed the plans for her young life. She should have had a proper chance to choose for herself, knowing of both between the teachings of Patrick and the life in the house of this noble youth. Seston was not himself a short man, although thin and light, but he felt the size and weight of the young boy beside the warrior who towered above him in the lamplight, easy and ungirt, excused on his informal evening from attending on the king. His long curling hair fell to the shoulders of his sea-green tunic, so smooth and fair that it was almost white, and gold gleamed warm at his wrists and neck. On the table lay his champion's collar, and the most coveted award in all of the military schools, and beside it the wide enameled belt that held his ivory-hilted sword, the heavy tassels of the yellow silk falling from it to the rushes of the floor. He was rich and noble and handsome and important, and all these things were in his face. Yet there was too an open, genial kindness that touched Seston more than guilt than any of his riches and position. "The business of the High King," echoed Keon, and the open, amiable face grew still and watchful. He was like a resting animal that scented danger, and to Seston he seemed to grow even larger in his quietness. Even the calm and polished LeBron, with all his life of position and authority behind him, found it difficult to begin and carry on his tale, facing the growing coldness of the fair, handsome face. Keon turned on Seston, and the icy, furious blue eyes raked him up and down. Behind the Avenger, Seston was conscious of bright, cheerful faces, eager warriors with death for their profession and the sword for sport, unconcerned to the causes, but their eyes lighting at the news of trouble. "This man, you say?" Keon's big, bare feet took a step towards Seston through the rushes. LeBron moved between them. "It is not he who took her, Keon. He is not the one for your vengeance." Keon did not take his eyes from Seston. "I am most fiercely moved to kill this one. He let her go. I am moved strongly to kill him now." The threat was dark and true on his face, and his cold glare was that of the Avenger, no longer the blue, genial gaze of the promised son of LeBron. He seemed aware of no one else but Seston. "Keon, my son!" LeBron's voice was clear and cold like a bell, the judge's voice ringing through the dwelling and ringing through Keon's anger until it pulled his reluctant eyes from Seston and brought his mind back to the man who spoke. "Keon, my son, forget him, at least for the moment. His guilt is small. Let us settle the business of the High King." Now Keon was fully aware of him again, and the cold blue eyes flew wide. "The business of the High King?" His voice was small and fierce with anger. "Is it only the business of the High King? Is it not my business? Was not Macha, the little red one, to be my bride? It is my business, and I will take my sword, the answerer, and will find this man from the sea, and I will kill him. And if life return to him 7 times, then I will take it 7 times, and turn then on those who have sheltered him. And the sword and the brand shall leave them neither life nor lodging. Laban stood and was silent, knowing that this was how it would be. He had understood that from the start that Chion would not undertake this with only his loyalty to the king to drive him, as he undertook most of his battles. There was more in it this time for him, for this betrothal to Maha was not as many marriages arranged between strangers with suitable guarantees of position and cattle, knowing nothing of each other. This fair mountain of a young man had a long memory of his own, a memory of a small red-haired girl who had pulled his curls and tugged at his bracelets when, as a boy, he had visited the dwelling of Laban. He had forgotten her when she went away to fosterage, but when he came to age to seek a bride, some old memory of affection had crept up and prompted him to go to Laban and ask him if his daughter was of marriageable age. Laban was touched and pleased, hoping for a marriage for his daughter in the same happiness that he had known with Brez, and a young Chion had waited with some secret delight that he would scarcely admit for the return of his small red-haired memory. Now he was raging with anger, cheated of some fragile happiness before he had even known it, shouting for his captains and his runners, with the candles jumping in the violence of his movements, and the spit wine of crimson stain across the table. He was determined that his disappointment should be avenged with violence. He had no care about the king. This was his revenge. Almost he had forgotten the 2 men who had brought him the news, until he nearly stumbled over the hapless Sesnan, who could not move fast enough to leave his way. He glared at him in blind blue fury. "In fetters," he cried, "in the wrath of the hostages until this thing is done. And if the girl is dead, it will be my sword loose on the red blood of his neck." "No, Chion." Laban planted himself firmly in front of the furious giant. "The girl is my daughter, and remember that I too would see justice done and her stealing avenged." She was not stolen, whispered Sesnan hopelessly. "She went." But no one listened to him. He shook his head against the impossible thought of Patrick taking anyone against their will, but Laban went on speaking to the impatient, angry Chion. "I will hold him at my side," he assured him. "If we get her back, then surely we can spare him, Chion," he said clearly and sharply, as if to remind the young warrior of something he had forgotten. "Chion, she is my child." Chion stopped his angry bustle and stood still, looking down at last at the older man as if he saw him and thought of what he felt. After a long moment of silence, he made a gesture of submission. "You are my father," he said, and he bent his fair head. He reached out and took Sesnan's limp hand, laying it on Laban's arm. "He is yours. Guard him well, for if I do not get her, I may have need of him." So it was the company of the warriors set out 4 days later at the first light of day. On the earthen walls of the Rath of Laban, the thickets of young trees on the sloping ramps were soft and new green, and the long wet grass was cold about their feet of Brez and her children, who had climbed the steep walls to watch the warriors go. Brez's heart was as cold as her dew-drenched feet, and she had no thought of the calling cuckoos and fresh promise of the breaking day. Laban had obediently promised her that Chion and his men would do all that was needed in the way of fighting. He was only to care for Maha when they found her, and to guard Sesnan as he had promised Chion. But Brez knew her high-spirited husband, who was no dry-as-dust druid for all his cleverness and learning, and she did not trust him to stay quietly in his chariot and remember that the battle was not for him if the smell of blood and dust was in his nostrils, and the war crying ringing in his ears, and the war cries ringing in his ears. Her fears for Lebron were drowned in the spasm of fury against her wayward daughter. When the child was safe home, what would she not have to say to her? All the pain and trouble she had caused with her folly. Ad's head in a new god. The sooner the girl was married, the better, and had no time to spare for such nonsense. Ad's head. The bright, thundering column had passed from off the hill, melting into the drifting morning mist that still crept across the plain below, and at last, glinting spear had the last glinting spear had passed from sight. Irritably, Brez swept her young children together. Ad's head indeed. Keon would make short work of Ad's head. Away now and prepare for school, she cried to the little ones. There is nothing more to see.